Welcome to the Acton Institute Events Podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. For over half a century, America has been suffering from a growing but strangely overlooked crisis, a flight from work by men in the prime of life. Just before the COVID-19 crisis, almost 7 million men, 25 to 54, were neither working nor looking for work. Employment rates for prime-aged U.S. men mirrored those near the end of the Great Depression. In the wake of the COVID-19 shock, America's men without work problem has become even more acute. In this episode, we're bringing you a presentation that was delivered as part of the 2021 Acton Lecture Series, featuring Nicholas Eberstadt, as he outlines the dimensions of the problem, examines some of its causes, discusses its far-reaching implications, and speculates about possible solutions. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes on our website at acton.org/eventspodcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Events Podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Churchwell, and I serve as the Director of Program Outreach here at the Acton Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt as our July Acton Lecture speaker. Dr. Eberstadt holds the Henry Wendt Chair of Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and for over 4 decades has published extensively on demographics, economic development, and international security, authoring hundreds of articles in professional and popular journals and several dozen books, including the book we're talking about today, Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, which came out in 2016. He's been invited to offer expert testimony before Congress on a wide range of social, economic, and international topics. And in 2012, he was awarded the prestigious Bradley Prize. And he has also delivered the Irving Kristol Lecture in 2020. Mr. Eberstadt earned his PhD from Harvard University. Welcome, Dr. Eberstadt.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight to be with my Acton friends this afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. The topic of my lecture today, however, is anything but delightful. This is the collapse of work for men in modern America. This is not a new problem. It has been gathering for 2 generations. It hasn't been recognized as much as it should have been as it has been building, although maybe now we can pay some attention to it. I'd like to tell you that things are looking better as we recover from the COVID-19 crisis, but I wouldn't be telling you the truth if I said that. This is a deep and far-reaching problem, and as concerned citizens, it's something that we all should know more about. Some strange things have been happening in the U.S. economy over the past 2 decades. Ordinarily, in a modern economy, there are 3 trends that tend to travel in tandem. But we are seeing ominous divergences between them. And we've been seeing these divergences accentuate for more than 2 decades now. The first is the trend in personal wealth in the United States. This is an absolutely extraordinary success story. The American economy is a wealth-producing machine like nothing that has ever existed on our planet. And the amount of private wealth sloshing in our country at the moment is an absolute historical wonder. If we divided personal wealth by the number of citizens in our country, it would work out to over $400,000 per person. For a notional household of four, that's more than $1.5 million. If we kept on trend, history doesn't work in a linear fashion, we know. But if we kept on this trend to the year 2100, the average wealth for the American population would be almost $4 million per person. Well, if this were all there were to the story, we could all go to happy hour and lift a glass. But as I think you may be suspecting, there's more to it. And we see a somewhat more sobering situation when we look at the long-term trend in national output, in real GDP production for our economy. And as we can see here, the American economy is shifting gears, and it's shifting down to a new and slower tempo. This was true before the Great Recession. You can kind of see this was true before the Great Recession. But it has been painfully evident in the decade and more since we crawled out of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. If we were only on our earlier post-war path of economic progress, at the beginning, at the eve of the COVID crisis, America would have over 20% more national income than it actually had. And even among friends, a 20% difference in income is a lot of money. So if our situation with wealth creation is fantastic, and our situation with national income, with economic production, is mediocre, the situation with job creation has been appalling since the turn of the new century. And you can see this here. Our work to population ratio, our work rate for people over the age of 20, has almost dropped through the floor. And for 10 long years after the Great Recession, we clawed back feebly, but not nearly to where we were in the year 2000. If work rates in America on the eve of the COVID crisis had been at the same levels that they were at the beginning of the century, we'd have had almost 8 million more jobs in America in 2019 than we actually had. So think of what a different country we would have had with 8 million more people with paid work in our society at that day. You can see that things have gotten a lot worse since the eruption of the COVID crisis. We'll talk about this a little later on. The work situation for women in America has been deteriorating for 2 decades, but the epicenter of the crisis of work in modern America has been among American men, and in particular, among American men of what is called prime working age. The 25 to 54-year-old group, that's the backbone of our economy, is also the critical age for persons who are forming and raising families. And if we take a look at what's happened with prime age male work, we can see a crisis that has been half a century and more in the making. This is it. We'll see that work rates for prime-age American men didn't change that much in the early post-war period. The 40s and 50s and early 60s, they kind of bounced around with no particular trend. But since the mid-60s, the trend is unmistakable, progressive, and downward. And we can see that with each business cycle, a new normal was established, which is lower and worse than the one before, recovers a little bit, then ratchets down again with the next recession. And there's very little recovery in sight. The arrow is going downwards unmistakably. We can look at this a little bit more carefully if we flip it around and just think about the percentage of prime-age American men who have no paid work, the workless men in our post-war society. What you see here is an ominous and seemingly relentless increase in the proportion of prime-age civilian, non-institutionalized American men. Those are terms of art, and they'll be meaningful in a few moments. From about the mid-1960s to the present. And if you care to do the averages by decade, you see that there has been a steady and almost relentless increase in the average monthly percentage of men with no paid work in the United States. And in the decade we just completed, in the 2010s, we were in a circumstance where almost 1 in 6 prime-age guys had no paid work in any given month, on average, over that decade. Almost 1 in 6. Now, I can put that into historical perspective for you. You see what this means in a historical context. So what we see here is the work rates for American men, for prime-age guys, or for a broader measure of American working-age men, for the 20 to 64 group, for the year 2019, which was a boom year in the American economy. We were we're almost at the top of a business cycle right before the COVID crisis. And in 2019, the work rates for prime American men were indistinguishable from the reported work rates for American men in 1940, from the 1940 census. Now, they were reporting about a period a little bit before 1940. They're reporting about the tail end of the Great Depression. So you'll see here in this slide, our work rate for guys in 2019 is identical to the tail end of the Great Depression. It's Great Depression scale worklessness rates for guys. And if you look at the 20 to 64s, the situation was actually worse in 2019 than it was in 1940 census, and much worse than in the 1930 census as well. I've put in sources and notes into all of my slides so that any members of the audience who wish to replicate my slide, any of these slides, have the sources and can do so for themselves. This is not fake news. This is not Nick's imaginary numbers. You can replicate these numbers yourself. That's the beginning of any serious argument about current events. So it's not fanciful or purely rhetorical to say that we have a we had a close to depression scale work problem for American men on the eve of the COVID crisis. But before the war, there were really only two work statuses for working age men in the United States. You were either employed, you either had a job, or you were looking for one. You were without a job and looking for one. That's a definition of unemployment. In our post-war economy, we have a third status, neither working nor looking for work, not in labor force. And this status has absolutely transformed the nature of the employment situation in the United States. And I'm going to show you that with the next slide. What I'm showing you here is a blue line and an orange line. The orange line is the head count since the end of World War II, the early post-war period. The head count of prime-age men who have no job but are looking for work. The blue line is neither working nor looking for work, out of the labor force. And you can see the exponential rise for more than half a century of the totals of guys who are neither working nor looking for work. This group is the group that now dominates the not paid labor force contingent in the male working age population. And in fact, in 2019, there were 4 times as many guys who were neither working nor looking for work as guys who were out of a job and looking for work, classically unemployed, definition of classical unemployment. So if you're only looking at the unemployment rate, you are missing not the whole story, but you're missing about 80% of the story of unworking men in modern America of prime working ages. Over time, the problem of exit from labor force, the flight from the workforce, has intensified year by year and cohort by cohort. And what you can see in this graphic here is that every new younger group in America has a lower likelihood of being in the labor force at any given age than the one before them. Younger brothers with a lower trajectory than older brothers with a lower trajectory than their younger uncles lower than the fathers lower than the older uncles. This looks almost like the rings of a tree. It looks like something physical, but there's no natural physical law to explain it. So this one is not my contribution to modern art. This isn't my attempt at a Mondrian. This shows America's circumstances internationally with respect to the flight from work for men in the post-war era. And it shows that the United States is winning a race that we shouldn't want to win. We are the dashed dark line that's almost at the bottom in this tableau. Our collapse of labor force participation rates for prime age men has been more distinct and stunning than in countries like Japan, which have suffered a generation of lost economic growth, or continental Europe, where they've been struggling under enormous burdens of welfare state, or a place like Greece, need I say more? We're way below Greece. We have to wonder why we have been winning this race against countries we might have expected might have less promising male work participation than the United States. We'll come back to that. We know a little bit about the demography of the American non-working man, prime-age guys who are neither working nor looking for work. This slide looks at the situation in 2015, and the profiles haven't changed terribly much since then, so use that because it's got a round number at the end of it. With respect to ethnicity, African Americans are way more likely to be in the pool of unworking men than the national average. But on the other hand, other persons of color are less likely than the national average. Asian Americans are less likely to be in this NILF pool than the national average. And Latino men are much less likely to be neither working nor looking for work. So the picture is mixed by ethnicity in the US. With respect to education, I think it's probably more or less what you'd guess. The less education one has, the more likely one is to be in this unworking pool. High school dropouts have the most are the most overrepresented in the unworking pool. College grads and people with graduate degrees, way less likely. Marital status seems to matter. It actually seems to matter a lot. Married guys are way less likely than the national average to be in this pool. Guys who have never been married, way more likely to be in it. And then we've got what the Census Bureau inelegantly calls nativity, and this is not a Christmas scene. This refers to whether or not you were born in the United States of America. And as you can see, if you are foreign born, you're way less likely to be in the unworking pool, the neither working or looking for work pool. And that's true, by the way, of every ethnic group within the foreign born contingent. If you're native born, you're more likely than average to be neither working nor looking for work. Now, I've just described to you some big probabilistic tendencies within the United States, but not everybody is a slave to these probability schedules. There is such a thing as volition, and there is such a thing as human agency. And as you will see in a moment, agency matters a great deal. Remember how you just saw that African Americans were overrepresented in the unworking pool. If you look here, this slide comparing married Black guys to never married white guys, you'll see that the African Americans have higher workforce participation rates than the Anglos in this situation. And this has been true for a generation. The more or less 10-point gap between Blacks and whites in labor force participation is totally vitiated. It's actually reversed a little bit by the marriage factor. With respect to education, there's more than 15-point gap overall between college grads and high school dropouts in the United States. But if you look at married high school dropouts and never married college grads, the gap is almost totally eliminated. The marriage factor almost totally eliminates the education factor here. Now, this is not because this ring is full of magic. It's rather because it's a marker. It's a marker for certain attitudes and behaviors and motivations and outlooks. Outlooks and behaviors that change results for people in large numbers in the way that they interact with society and the economy. So why have we had this terrible developing men without work problem in the United States? The conventional answer in policy land and in the economics profession is that this is a consequence of structural economic change. Big changes in the economy, that are leading to a decline in demand for less skilled labor. And as far as that goes, that explanation is totally unobjectionable. There are worldwide tendencies to this effect. But it is not the whole story, and it may not even be most of the story, as I am going to show you now. Exhibit A for the defense here is the rate of NILF, or out of labor force, prime age men in the United States from 1965 to the present. And as you'll see from this chart, it's almost a straight line up. If this were a structural economic change phenomenon, primarily driven by changes in demand, you'd see big swings with the recessions and changes in business cycles over time. They're not there. You'd see maybe big shocks when we had technological disruptions, the internet or the introduction of this beautiful little device. They're not there. This is almost a social science straight line. It's got an R squared of over 96%. So where's the demand-driven shock? So here's exhibit B for the defense. These are labor force participation rates for high school dropout prime age guys, but for different groups, contingents within the high school dropout population. At the top, we've got the foreign-born married guys. At the very gruesome bottom, we've got native-born guys who've never been married. There's almost a 40 percentage point gap in labor force participation between these two groups of dropouts. So, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of skeptical that K through 10 education in El Salvador is so much better than in the United States as to explain this in terms of skill differences. And if you can't explain it in terms of skill differences, you've got to come up with another demand-oriented solution, if that's your view as to what's gone on. The final exhibit for the defense. I was trained in economics a long time ago. It was shortly after the Stone Age, but back in those misty climes, they taught us that markets seek an equilibrium, and after a market shock, equilibrium tends to resume. We have a national labor force in the United States, and yet we have an extraordinary divergence of NILF rates for prime age guys between our states. Big divergences between adjacent states, by the way, like Maine and New Hampshire, or West Virginia and Maryland, Virginia. And the variation between states has progressively increased over time. If we didn't have U-Hauls, if we couldn't move, maybe that would explain it, but I think we still can. So this doesn't really comport terribly well with the demand-driven shock thesis. So if we're not dealing with a demand-driven phenomenon, what else could we be dealing with? Two other things. Regular economic taxonomy would suggest. One is supply side problems, and the other would be institutional barriers. What sort of supply side problems could we have? Well, possibly men are withholding their services from the labor market for some reason. What could be a reason? Well, let's look at the next slide. This slide shows us the proportion of prime age guys by different employment statuses who are receiving one or more benefit from the U.S. government, and in particular, disability benefits. benefits which one gets because one is unable to work or says one is unable to work qualifies for that. I don't have the absolutely up-to-date figures. We're always looking in the rearview mirror for the data from the U.S. government on this. But the most recent information that I have to present to you today shows that the proportion of guys in the NILF pool who are obtaining one or more disability benefits has jumped substantially since the 1980s. And in these figures that I have here, more than half of the guys who are neither working nor looking for work are obtaining at least one government disability benefit. Now, this is not to suggest that our disability programs are creating the men without work problem, but it's incontestable that these programs are financing the penurious existence that such men are subsisting on. And it's even more dispiriting than that. Life on disability pensions is an enormous waste of human potential and of talent. And it also has other, I think, highly adverse implications for the recipients and for those that they love and their family members, their communities. And we can see some of that in this slide here, which shows self-reported time use for people by different employment statuses. Prime age guys, obviously, who are in the NILF pool, don't work. We know that. Even though they have an enormous amount of time on their hands, they devote strangely little of it to helping others around their homes or to home chores. They don't do much at all in civil society. I don't show that here, but there's almost no worship or volunteering or charitable work. What they do is they watch screens. We don't know what they watch, but they report watching screens. And for guys who are neither employed nor in education and training, the self-reported time use in front of screens is about 2,000 hours a year, as if a full-time job. This is not a way of living that's going to help you get back into civil society or the national economy. And the situation is even worse than that, I'm afraid. We all know about the opioid crisis, unfortunately. About half of the men who are neither working nor looking for work report that they use painkillers every day. And in a most awful sort of unintended consequence, U.S. government policy may have helped to contribute to this opioid crisis. We can see this we can suspect this from the information here about government assistance through our low-income healthcare program, Medicaid. Until very recently, if you went to a pill factory and found a pill doctor who would write you a script because you said you were in pain, you would pay $3 out of pocket for 90 OxyContin. And Uncle Sam, which is to say you and I, the taxpayers, would pay for the rest of this. Just exactly how the opioid crisis for men without work has developed is something that we don't know all the answers to yet, but I'm afraid that some of the forensics here look truly tragic. There's one other part of the puzzle that we need to look at, and this is institutional barriers. There is a big institutional barrier that the U.S. government collects almost no information on. I'm showing it here to you in a study that independent academic demographers have prepared. This is the crime and punishment phenomenon, more particularly the explosion of criminalized population in America in the post-war era. The estimates I'm showing you here suggest that as of the year 2010, there were almost 20 million American men and women with a felony in their background. Back of the envelope calculation suggests that number might be more like 25 million today. You'll recall that we have the mass incarceration problem in the US with more than 2 million men and women, mainly men, obviously, behind bars. Well, do the arithmetic. 2 million behind bars, 25 million in all, well over 20 million Americans, mainly men, are in society, in civil society, living with felony convictions on their record. That's something like 1 in 8, maybe closer to 1 in 7 working age men. We do not collect records on any of this, but this statistically invisible problem also bears directly and immediately and inescapably on the circumstances that I've shown you already. America recovered in a remarkably effective way, by many regards, from the terrible COVID shock. I mean, almost nobody in February of 2020 would have imagined that we were going to have a widely available vaccine, more than one widely available vaccine by November of that same year. Yet we did. But you'll see that something strange happened, or rather didn't happen, after the rollout of our vaccines, of our COVID vaccines. The work rate stalled in the United States. Why? I mean, at this point, 2/3 of the adult population has been vaccinated. What's keeping people from work? Well, the answer isn't a lack of spending power. You'll see here that Americans actually have more money in their pockets during the COVID emergency than they ever had before. We're actually still above the long-term trend in the United States. The differential here, of course, is government transfers based upon public borrowing, all public debt, all transfers. And the transfers may have had unintended consequences on our recovery, our labor force. Up until the COVID crisis, the number of unemployment insurance beneficiaries was always much lower than the total number of reported people who were unemployed, 50%, as a general rule. But things have changed since the COVID emergency. We now have more beneficiaries of unemployment insurance than we have unemployed people. Since the COVID emergency, we've had somewhere between 150 and 200 beneficiaries for every 100 unemployed people. It's the famous $600 a week, whether you want it or not. It's helicopter money. And some of this has had unintended consequences, I'm afraid. And you can see this from my final slide. Since the rollout of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, the number of unfilled positions in the US economy has leapt by over 2 million. We never have had so many unfilled positions in the United States, unfilled job slots as we have now. And they're not just for chemical engineers and computer coders and hedge fund managers. Millions of them are for people in the retail trade and for people in hotel, restaurant. Also in construction, you have to have a strong back, but you don't need to have advanced degrees for that. But this is our situation now. Worse in some ways than it's been for a long time. Huge unfilled numbers of positions in the United States, even as the prime age male work rate approximates maybe 1939 levels. So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid there's very little redeeming, uplifting information in the tale I've just told you. The men without work problem has led to slower growth in the United States, to bigger gaps in wealth and income within our society, probably to more welfare dependence, certainly to more public debt. It's putting more pressure on fragile families. It's slowing social mobility. It's having deleterious impacts on public participation in civil life, and it may even have some ugly political ramifications. What you, as informed men and women, can do is keep this problem front and center in your attention. Because unless concerned citizens pay attention to this problem, I fear it is only going to get worse over time. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity to address you on this problem, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Eberstadt, for that stimulating, if not depressing, conversation. We're really thankful that you can join us for some live Q&A. We have a lot of questions coming in over our platforms. Please do, if you're watching and have a question, email that to digital@acton.org or use the YouTube Live or Facebook Live platform to enter your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. The one question I wanted to start with is, what would you articulate the true main problem is? I mean, you did a great job. Thank you for the slide deck, right? 24 really good slides to demonstrate this issue. Would you argue does this skew more economic or cultural? In other words, someone might frame it, what's the big deal? The economy's recovering, the stock market is expanding, there is wealth being created. Is this the best way to look? Is it cultural or more economic? What are your thoughts on that?
Dan, thank you for asking that. We've got a practical problem and we've got an ethical problem. And I think they're inseparable here. The practical problem is that despite our vast wealth, I don't think we can go on the way we are heading and enjoy all of the benefits of continuing prosperity. Much of America, too much of America, is being brought along in the train of our prosperity through the devices of public debt and personal debt. Either through welfare or through personal unsustainable borrowing or both. And that I don't think can go on forever in a prosperous, successful society. The ethical problem is that we see men who should be the protectors and the defenders and the builders of the contributors to our society being detached from those roles in a way that I think is most unnatural and not good for the men. I mean, look at what is happening with the opioid catastrophe today. Everybody, I think, needs to have a purpose. They need to be able to answer the question, who am I and what am I doing? And a lot of that has to do with doing things for a family, providing service to your community through employment, being part of a community, being part of a faith community. The anomie that we see here, I think it's more than a practical crisis. It's also an ethical crisis in our society.
Yeah, we already have a great number of questions coming in from the platforms. One question is it possible that the lower numbers that you reference are simply males retiring early due to increased wealth, or high school students and college students not working like they used to?
A very good question. I was looking mainly at the 25 to 54 group, the so-called prime working age group, termed that for obvious reasons. If we look at the 55 plus group, the 55 plus group up until the COVID shock was really the only ray of sunshine in the long-term American employment picture. It's the 55 plus group where work rates were rising from the 1990s through the 2000s to the 2010s. So the crisis that I outlined can't be explained really by early retirement unless one thinks that going to a disability at 38 and waiting until you get your Social Security check at 62 is early retirement. I think that's a terrible waste of human potential. Yeah. It's terrible for the people who are experiencing this. There's a good argument that with additional training, maybe people don't go into the workforce typically as early as they did in 1946. And Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers count the workforce from 16 and beyond, even from before you finish high school or would finish high school. The groups that I was looking at were a little older, 25 to 54s. So I think we've got a pretty good argument that these really are people who are in the prime of life. Yeah. And part of being in the prime of life is being economically active and flourishing.
Another one in a similar vein is it seems that people are moving less often than now, particularly from places like depicted in J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, even though other places might provide more work opportunities. Why do you think this seems to be the case?
It's an excellent question. And I can't give you a categorical answer, but I can share with you my hunches. Hunch number one, there is less churning in the American economy than there used to be. There's less literal mobility and changing of jobs. There's less new startups in relation to total number of businesses. And with less dynamism in business, there may be less opportunity for finding work elsewhere. Although, as we saw, there are a lot of unfilled jobs in America. There's plenty of unfilled work in America today. Second hunch, with increased dependence on disability benefits and welfare benefits, there may be less incentive or more apprehension about moving. Welfare benefits are not fully portable, if you follow my drift. They're state administered, not federally administered for the most part. And for that reason, they may provide unintentionally a disincentive for people to move in pursuit of opportunity. Then there's an elephant also hiding in the room, which is the 20 plus million ex-cons who are invisible in our society, the people who are ex-cons not behind bars. I think it's probably hard to ask your probation officer in Georgia for permission to go and see what Hawaii's like. So there's all three of those factors, I think, are part of the answer. I don't know if that's all of the answer, but I think those are three different parts.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And along with that, do you think some of the, you can't go a day without reading some headline about some people call it artificial intelligence or machine learning, and kind of some of the job disruption that's either coming or in process now. Your slide deck, you did a good job of showing that largely it's people who are less educated, not married, unattached, that have the highest rate of not performing in this. Do you think that the future of work is there an automation or a technology component, do you think, at this time in this discussion?
Well, there's always been. There's always been a mechanization, an automation, a structural transformation phenomenon in economies. I mean, we displaced an enormous number of people from rural settings and from agriculture in the Industrial Revolution. And now we have, a series of continuing revolutions underway. It's really hard for me to tell whether the machine learning, AI spectrum is going to be qualitatively different from what we've gone through already. Whether it is or it's not, the response that we should make is clear either way. We need to skill up. As I said in the presentation, college is not for everybody, but everybody must have a skill when they get out of school, something that they can learn, that they can support a family with. And by the way, once you learn one skill, it's way easier to learn other skills. It's like a muscle that you develop.
For sure. And this question from the audience riffs off this idea too. If someone asked, if you could make one single policy change to address the problems you highlighted, what would that be?
One single change. All right. And it's a policy change. So I can't fix the family in America, and I can't fix civil society in America. The policy lever that I think that, in my opinion, economist Raj Chetty was judicious in suggesting one policy would be paying good teachers well. He didn't say firing bad teachers, but let me add that to the mix. And in addition, getting some of the snobbery out of the educational establishment so that what we used to call vocational training is no longer treated with such disdain. People who learn good skills can raise families, they can have nice homes. They need to have the skill, and between a good HVAC training and a comp lit degree, I think you go with the training, with the vocational training every time.
Absolutely. I mean, we had a very wet spurt of rain here through Michigan several weeks ago, and people they can't find people to replace their sump pumps because there's just a dearth of, and those people are making really, really great wages. At least in our region, the plumbers are making.
I think all over the country,
and they just can't find people to.
But it's a skill. If you're going to support yourself, you have to be willing to work. You have to have the skill to sell, and those two things, I think, can make a radical difference in our circumstance today.
In somebody else from the online audience asks, in your studies, have you found any parallel phenomenon in other Western countries of men leaving the workforce?
Well, that weird little kind of like modern art slide that I showed indicates that pretty much everywhere there is a downward trend, in the OECD countries, in the affluent Western democracies. There's a downward trend, but it's more pronounced in the US than almost anywhere else. And we have to ask why. Now, there are some people who will say it's because the US is less unionized and has less union bargaining than other places. There are other arguments that we have deindustrialized. Maybe. I mean, those are legitimate questions to pursue. I'm not totally convinced by those. If you take a look at what's happened in the United States, for example, with respect to the proportion of workforce in industry and manufacturing, we're kind of similar to Canada and Australia. We're obviously culturally similar as well. We've got a much more pronounced and worrisome trend for workforce participation for guys.
I was reading recently that in America, that 40% of households, the main breadwinner is now female. The female, the woman is bringing in households the vast majority of the income. And do you you read about college, and there's more women are going to college, or at least graduating from college. Do you think, how do these correlate? Are they just filling the vacuum, or is there a different correlation that we should be looking at?
Well, I should have put in, if we'd had another hour for the lecture, I could have put in slides about workforce participation for American women. And obviously women have always been working. It's just that since the end of World War II, they got paid for it a little bit more. In workforce participation, there was a big upward trend from the end of the war until about the year 2000 for women. But the overall national work rate and participation rate was also going up, which is to say that women weren't displacing men, really. They were augmenting. Since the year 2000, both the female and the male labor force participation rates have been kind of coming down. So it's, again, not as if women are displacing men. Both women and men are kind of suffering, the way it looks to me. In many of the households, I think that you're referring to, Dan, there are no guys. And so, perforce, the woman is going to be the breadwinner. And that's a difficult situation, not just for the woman involved, but for the kids. We've got a lot of social science to talk about outcomes there. It's not optimal. What we can say, I think, is that there's a crisis of male participation, not just in the workforce, but also in the family, and it's not unrelated. All of the data that I have seen suggests that if you have a child under your roof and you are a guy, doesn't matter if you're married or unmarried, just cohabiting, you are more likely to be in the workforce looking for putting bread on the table. And I don't think that is an astonishing finding.
Yeah. Somebody else from the audience asks a similar question, but how much of this problem is informed by young people delaying the start of doing usually adult things? In other words, moving out of their parents' house, getting married, having kids. Is there a correlation to the delay in that age group?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. Absolutely. And as our informed questioner probably knows, we've had this sea change demographically with the what some have called the failure to launch generation, people who are staying at home with their parents. It's more likely now than in the past, and actually more likely to be in parents' homes than starting families for the 25 to 34-year-old male group. Disproportionately overrepresented is the less educated, less skilled contingent there. So certainly that's a question. But even when you look at people in their late 30s and in their 40s and into their early 50s, you see the same troubling trends. And if you recall one of those slides I was showing you earlier, the downward mobility slide for men, we're seeing a pattern for each rising cohort, at least over the post-war period, at any given age, having lower likelihood of being in the workforce than the cohort immediately before it. So it's an ongoing trend that we shouldn't want to see continue.
What was interesting or fascinating to me too is that if the married trend line isn't dropping as fast, is that, if they're married and at least graduate from high school, if not college,
Sure.
that it's precipitously less, right, of people not in labor force, if some of those cultural things are in place. Was that right?
Sure. Now the counter argument is that this is all circular, and if you aren't a good breadwinner, you're going to be less likely to be an attractive mate. And certainly it's true that for the huge contingent of people who have been arrested and released from prison or who are felonized, they don't seem to, they've got a lot of disadvantages going into the marriage market. So it's not a one-directional problem, but it is a tangle of things, tangle of knots we should wish to untie.
Well, Dr. Eberstadt, we really do appreciate your time, the tremendous amount of work that's gone into your research. Please do pick up his book, Men Without Work, and continue to follow his ongoing scholarship at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Eberstadt.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure for me, Dan.
And for those of you joining us, thank you for joining us for July's Acton Lecture Series. We will be promoting our August lecture series soon here. So please join us next month for the Acton Lecture Series, and have a wonderful day.